We're going to go ahead and get started. I want to thank several people for making this evening possible. Thank you to Amanda and Beth Israel, wherever you are on my view right now, for helping us with the Zoom link. Thank you to Mark Saper for helping with all of the logistical technicalities. And thank you, of course, to Gavi for being with us this evening and sharing with us information about your upcoming book. I am going to now introduce Nat Bencione, who's going to introduce Gavi to us all. Prior to doing that, I also want to make a plug that we're going to, because of the success of this event and our prior one a few weeks ago with Professor Gittleman, we're going to be having another one in March. So stay tuned with an upcoming author. So you will all get information about that. Nat is currently a literary consultant who is receiving a degree in writing, literature, and publishing at Emerson College. She will also be running the marketing division for Plowshares, which is a literary journal of American fiction and poetry. And she is a lifelong friend of Gavi Savit, who will now introduce him. Thank you all.
Thanks, Monica. As Monica mentioned, tonight's speaker and I are lifelong friends, thanks in no small part to the community in which we were raised. So before beginning with the official introduction, I would like to take a moment to express my profound gratitude to the Ann Arbor Orthodox Minyan for bringing Gavriel and his family into my life. Many of you know Gavriel Savit. He was raised in Ann Arbor, Michigan, attending the Hebrew Day School of Ann Arbor, Hillel Day School in Detroit, Pioneer High, and the University of Michigan. In addition to his starring roles in several local theater productions, Gavriel has appeared on Broadway and performed on stages around the world as an actor, singer, and musician. His New York Times bestselling literary debut, Anna and the Swallow Man, was named Best Book of the Year by Publishers Weekly, Shelf Awareness, and the American Booksellers Association, receiving the 2017 Sidney Taylor Award and the National Jewish Book Award for Debut Fiction, among many other distinctions. His new novel, The Way Back, is a National Book Award finalist and, as of this week, the 2020 National Jewish Book Award recipient for young adult literature. Gavriel joins us tonight from his home in Springfield, Illinois, where he lives with his wife, Livia, their daughters, Lily and Molly, and a dog named Yitz. Please join me in welcoming Gavriel Savit to tonight's virtual AAOM Melave Malka event.
Whoa, thank you, Nat. That is an intimidating introduction. I'll spend my life trying to live up to it. It's wonderful to be here talking with you all. It is a wonderful sort of virtual homecoming for me. Very excited to be able to share both The Way Back with you all and also some larger stories about my bizarre rise to some sort of literary success. I want to start off by giving you all fair warning. If you were with us 2 weeks ago for Reb Tzvi Gittleman's erudite and scholarly talk, you are in for a much less well-learned experience this evening. However, you should fully blame Tzvi for any mistakes that I make. In fact, I want to start out by sharing a little bit of a story about one of the very sort of earliest bits of thinking about this book. I should say one of the questions that you get most often when you're touring with a novel is, where did the idea for the book come from? Which is a terrible and ridiculous question because novels have many, many roots and tails and never start in one place. But this evening we'll sort of try and seek out some of the roots of The Way Back, and one of them was I spent all of Shabbos trying to remember what the event was. I remember we were in Hillel back when we could be in buildings. I remember it was an evening. My inclination was that it wasn't a breakfast; it was a simcha of some sort. All I remember was that there was a buffet, as there very often is. At events of Jews. And I was standing in line behind Tzvi, and I've been thinking about the very beginning of this book. And I asked him, whether there were any records in Jewish sources of Napoleon coming through the Pale of Settlement, because, of course, in his great push into Russia, he moved through basically, the area where all of our ancestral Stadtlich were. And I thought to myself, surely there must be some sort of record or source that shows this very, very important historical event, not just for Russia and France and, the secular world, but also for the Jews. I mean, Napoleon was a very, very important influence on Jews in the 19th century. Tzvi, it blows my mind that he wasn't able to give me a source standing there on his feet trying to, schmear a bagel. But by the time I arrived home, of course, in my email inbox, there was, of course, a source telling a story about Napoleon coming to Shul, basically, on Purim. The story goes that they were reading the Megillah, and all of a sudden they heard a great commotion at the door, and they looked, and there was Napoleon standing in the doorway on Purim, looking into the door of this little, wooden shul in the Pale of Settlement. I think the consensus now is that this story is almost certainly apocryphal. It fits a little bit too neatly with the sort of sense that Napoleon turned the world upside down. Purim is obviously the perfect moment for Napoleon to appear in a Jewish context, but it certainly got the gears in my head moving. And so I'd like to share with you all now the very beginning of the way back. And soon enough, I hope you'll see what the connection is. Chapter 1, 2 from Tupik. On a bright summer day in the year 1812, by the Gentile reckoning, a girl left her mother's house, the little house where she had been born, and went to the brambles on the far side of the forest to gather the small summer strawberries that grow in the shade. These were the best kind of berries, tiny and soft, and the girl crouched in the bushes, staining her lips and fingertips red, one for her mouth, one for her apron, and so on and on. At first, the girl was sure that she must be imagining things. She was far from the village here, far from the road, and she alone knew of the berry bush. Surely, no one else would come to this place. But she was not imagining things. The column burst out into the clearing like a ball from a musket. Men in orderly rows, stepping in time, their buttons and bayonets shining in the sun, and more and more and more men. The young lady had never seen so very many. Now horses came as well, and taller men in splendid uniforms astride them. Mules and wagons and great bronze cannons thundered past the girl in the brambles, and feet and hooves and studded wheels churned the grass into a muddy slough. The girl was not foolish. She kept hidden and did not draw attention to herself. But when one particular man reached the clearing, she could not help but rise up to get a better look. Even in the heat of the summer sun, he wore his long, pale blue coat. The gray stallion beneath him moved dexterously at his urging, as if it were a part of him, and as he loped out into the clearing, it quickly became clear that the entirety of the column, all the men and horses and cannons and shot, all of it, was simply an extension of his body. This, of course, was the great war emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. He had come to take the Russian Empire. He'd come to take the world. An officer on a dappled charger came cantering up to his elbow, and the emperor turned his head. It was in this moment that he caught sight of the girl in the bushes. His eyes bore into hers, and she locked her lips tight, unwilling to let even the lightest breath pass between them. The officer was speaking. The emperor did not look away. And then he turned back toward the horizon, answered his officer, and spurred on his horse. And that was that. The girl made her way home. The sun sank behind the advancing troops. The year wore on. Battles were fought. Men were killed. The leaves changed color and fell. Napoleon retreated, and in due course was overthrown. Soon thereafter, the girl was led beneath a wedding canopy, where she traded the name of her father for the name of her husband, and from that day on she lived in his house, cleaned his mess, boiled his chicken soup, and waited for him to return home at night. But something odd happened. One day, the girl looked into the mirror and found that the face staring back at her was no longer her own. She had loosened, wrinkled, worried herself into something that no longer resembled her at all. Only her lips remained the same, locked in a light, tight frown. That evening, her husband did not come home. It was not long before she knew that he would not be returning at all. The frown deepened. Before the week was out, the lady who had been a girl took her son, Zalman, and moved far away from the village of her birth to a place where no one knew and where no one would whisper, all the way to a tiny, out-of-the-way shtetl called Tupik. She took a small room in the attic of the baker's house and apprenticed her boy in the bakery on the ground floor. The baker died. The bakery passed to the lady's son, Zalman. She remained in the attic, and as if in a chrysalis of silence, the lady in the attic turned into an old woman. Before long, as she was eldest, the women of Tupik began to call upon her to attend the births of children, and for more than a generation, every boy and girl born into the shtetl of Tupik was caught by the old woman's hands. But only 2 of them made any lasting impression on her. The first was a scrawny boy, born before his time into a blustery, rain-soaked evening. When his tiny eyes blinked open, bright and clear and icy blue, they focused perfectly into hers. She had seen that expression before, once, as a girl, long ago, crouched in the brambles, fingers stained, fear in her heart, sweetness on her lips. 8 days later, breaking with her custom, the old woman went to the synagogue to hear what name the boy would be given. It was Yehuda Leib. And that evening, the child of her son Zalman was born, a girl named Bluma. And as the baby emerged, pink and squalling, the old woman found herself filled with a sense of unutterable gladness. But when she looked down at her granddaughter's face, another feeling stole into her heart, a sort of guilt, of pity and compassion. There, as if reflected in a little mottled mirror, was her very own mouth, locked in a light, tight frown. So that's the beginning of the way back. And from there, we go on to track Yehuda Leib and Bluma into their childhood until one fateful evening, a visitor comes through the little shtetl and upends everything. We'll talk a bit more about the specifics of the way back going on, but now I want to take a little step back for those of you who are not regular guests at my parents' Shabbos table to review the steps of my life thus far. As was mentioned in the ridiculously kind introduction, I am indeed a son of Ann Arbor. I grew up in the Ann Arbor Orthodox Minyan. I'm a proud son of the Ann Arbor Hebrew Day School. And I went to school at the University of Michigan, where I received my BFA in musical theater. Now, believe it or not, if there can be said to be such a thing, a BFA in musical theater from the University of Michigan is about as practical a BFA in musical theater as you're going to find. Ann Arbor is very lucky to have a world-class, a leading, perhaps the preeminent training program in musical theater in the world. And I was very, very lucky to be admitted and to receive my training there. I really give credit for much of my success to my training at the musical theater program, not because you need a degree in musical theater to write fiction, but rather because one of the sort of great focuses of that program is to teach young people how to be professional artists. And there are far too many very, very talented writers, doubtless far more talented than I, who are molding away in their garrets because no one taught them to answer emails on time. So I'm very, very profoundly grateful for the wonderful training that I received at the University of Michigan's musical theater program. After graduation, with all the love and honor and respect that I can give to my parents, about as quickly as possible, I moved to New York City, as is really the only realistic path forward in musical theater. New York is, in the world, really the capital of musical theater. And if you're going to try and make it there, as the song has it, you got to not take your time about it. So I moved out there, and I was pretty lucky. I joined the Actors Union, Actors Equity, which is one of the older labor unions in the United States, actually venerable, though unfortunately toothless because of the nature of the industry. I joined that union on a great van tour around to school gymnasiums of a musical version of A Christmas Carol, which we could spend an entire hour talking about alone. But that was a lot of fun, and really taught me the truth of all the romantic stories that you hear of, splitting hotel rooms 5 ways. That's a real thing. I should say motel rooms. Let's be honest here. In any case, I had a number of really very wonderful opportunities. I did an off-Broadway show called The Voca People, which some of you might be familiar with. A deeply strange and surprisingly entertaining show that combines a cappella music with slapstick comedy, all while wearing white grease paint, like head to toe. Very, very strange. Israeli, though, which either, depending on your orientation, explains the strangeness or deepens it. It was a really wonderful opportunity. We played off Broadway for a fair amount of time. Shortly thereafter, I did the first incarnation of the show that would eventually take me to Broadway, Amazing Grace, another deeply strange show that could take up another hour of conversation. But between Amazing Grace and my next really wonderful opportunity, which was a tour through Japan with the Tokyo Symphony Orchestra singing Disney music. It's an annual, sometimes now biannual tour with the bizarre name of Disney on Classic, which makes about as much sense in Japanese as it does in English. Before I joined up with Disney on Classic, I had as one does in the commercial musical theater, had a bit of a dry spell. So I found myself in no small part, thanks to my lovely wife, to whom all thanks are due, working in the basement of a Mexican restaurant in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. Now, most people who are not on this Zoom call would know this Mexican restaurant by its proper name. It's named after Chavela Vargas, the wonderful singer. However, if one of us walked down the street and saw the name over the door, we would undoubtedly look up at the front of this Mexican restaurant and say, they called the restaurant Gavriel's. It's a great restaurant. It was very, very wonderful that I was given the opportunity to keep body and soul together there, because otherwise, my unemployment insurance was running out. By the way, if you're ever there and you are so inclined, the fish taco is really something to behold. But my job at Gavriel's was to sit in the basement in the prep kitchen while very bizarre mariachi music played very loudly. There's the prep kitchen, so they're doing like all of the chopping and whatever, and like periodically either the the fat trap, the grease trap would overflow, and like the entire floor would be covered in the most foul smelling gelatinous substance you can imagine. Or they would be pitting chilies, and the air it'd be like mustard gas. You wouldn't be able to breathe. Meanwhile, my job was to sit down there at, I think, the smallest desk in creation. And those of you who know me know that I am not the smallest man in creation. I was sitting at this little tiny desk, and my job for 7 hours a shift was to sit there and answer the phone and put delivery orders into the screen. Needless to say, I got bored. So what did I do? I started thinking about ways that I could keep my sort of artistic side going. And I invented a notion that I was going to turn into a solo performance piece. It was inspired in large. I was listening to, as I do now, I was listening to a lot of podcasts in those days, and I had heard 2 very choice episodes of a long-running BBC radio show called In Our Time, which is a deep dive with leading experts in a particular field on a narrow subject. And 2 episodes of In Our Time came to my ear in quick succession. One of them was about the sort of folk heroic aspect of the Robin Hood story, how sort of rumors collected around the edges of sort of English market towns and combined to give us these ballads that turned into the sort of myth of Robin Hood that we know now. The other one was a discussion of Benjamin Wilkomersky's infamous fraudulent Holocaust memoir, Fragments. And it really got me thinking about folk memory and about the way we narratize our own experiences, particularly extreme and heightened experiences, and the sort of swirl of questions about memory and accuracy and really uncertainty led me to start theorizing a sort of performance piece that I could put together, cribbed in no small part from a really wonderful one-man play called Underneath the Lintel. If any of you are so moved to seek it out, there's a great recording of Richard Schiff of West Wing fame, who plays Toby Ziegler, fantastic character and fantastic actor, playing the part of this Dutch librarian who receives a book through the slot that's 100 years overdue, and he goes out and starts to track down clues to who might have returned it, and it turns out he theorizes that it's the Wandering Jew. So this is another sort of piece of the puzzle that clicked into place, and my notion was that I was going to create a story that I could bring to life as a solo performance piece about having discovered an unpublished manuscript of a Holocaust memoir in the back of some used bookstore. I was going to go through the manuscript, and it was going to sort of land on the knife's edge between heightened memory and sort of magical realist myth. And it was going to be about, how, is this possible? What is possible in these heightened circumstances? What do our memories do? And the sort of inherent uncertainty of the stories we tell about our experiences. The first thing I had to do in order to get this solo performance piece off the ground was write this manuscript so I could refer to it. So I sat down and banged something together in 5 weeks. And that, when my wife, who was then my girlfriend, read it, turned out to be On the Swallow Man, my first novel, which, if any of you have read it, you will undoubtedly recognize some of those themes of uncertainty and personal myth making. I was totally caught by surprise by the fact that I had just written a novel. That was, I had played around with writing book length things before, but not in any serious way. I'd never seen myself as someone who was going to pursue a career in writing, but Livia insisted that this thing had some legs, and so I did the only thing that I thought could possibly push the ball down the field. I sent it to Nat, and Nat read it, and she said, "This is good. You should try and get an agent." So I did. I was very lucky to land with a wonderful agent named Catherine Drayton at an agency called Inkwell Management, who is a force of nature, as most things that reside in Australia are. And she sold the book to a really world-class editor who I am privileged to work with, named Aaron Clark. The coattails that I am riding on this team belong to a writer named Marcus Zusak, who has both the same agent and the same editor as I do. And you may know him from his mega seller, The Book Thief, which shares some similarities with Out on the Swallow Man. But my feeling is that they're pretty distinct as well. In any case, I sort of fell backwards into this literary success and did my best not to sneeze and like scatter it all to dust. And it came out in 2016. In October of that year, Livia and I left our apartment at the corner of Eastern Parkway and Franklin in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, just down the street from Chavez. And we came back to Ann Arbor to get married, which was a wonderful time. And then we set out not long thereafter on one of the greatest experiences of my life. A 2-month honeymoon through the great capitals of Europe. I'm going to miss some, believe it or not. But we went to Amsterdam, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest. We went to Sofia. We went to Thessaloniki. We went to Athens. We went to Rome. We went to Florence, Venice. We went to Barcelona, Cordoba. We went to Dublin. And we ended in Reykjavik. And in Reykjavik, one of the most difficult things that has ever happened to me occurred. We lost at 24 weeks gestation our first pregnancy. And it was impossibly difficult, as I'm sure you can imagine. At that age or size, I suppose, the body has to be delivered. So we did that in the National Hospital of Iceland. And I had one of the strangest experiences of my life, which is the child was born and I held her and I looked down at her and she looked like me. And I had never seen someone dead who looked like me before. And that stuck in my brain. After this very, very difficult experience, we moved back to Ann Arbor, where we were privileged to reconnect with many of you. We took an apartment in a wonderful spot that is nonetheless a terrible apartment. It's down by the Huron River, right by Argo Canoe Livery, right over there. And the door of our apartment was just down the hill from a small, not neglected, but not often used cemetery called Fairview Cemetery, where I spent a lot of time walking my dog and thinking. One of the things that's really difficult, and also a blessing, I will say, in Jewish tradition, is that a child who dies at a time that is younger than 30 days of life, so you have to be born alive and live 30 days in order to qualify for rites of mourning. Any child that dies before those 30 days of life doesn't qualify for any mourning rites, which on the one hand is surprisingly comforting because it gives you context for the fact that there's a difference. And there is a difference. I say this with confidence now as a man with 2 lovely daughters. There's a difference. And also, it leaves you at a bit of a loss about what to do with yourself because it's still a very severe blow and there's no system in place for, contextualizing what you've got going on. And I think that that's a very important portion of what became the way back. I was looking for something that felt to me real on a spiritual level that could combine my feelings about death and childhood and returning home in a way that there didn't really seem to be a whole lot of scaffolding for. Um, so I walked around Fairview Cemetery and I thought, and often as I would walk around Fairview Cemetery, I would listen to music, as many of us do. And one of the last shows that I saw before I left New York was a really phenomenal show that many of you will now know called Hadestown. Hadestown was the last Best Musical Tony winner before the world shut down. At the time when I saw it, it was in development. It was off Broadway. I actually had the opportunity while I was living in Ann Arbor in 2017 to fly to New York and audition for the next step in the development of Hadestown. Hadestown, for those of you who are not familiar, is a sort of hobo jazz retelling of the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. I deeply recommend it. It is one of the best things to hit the musical theater in the 21st century. It's phenomenal. You should listen to all the recordings and you should see it when it's back on stage. But that sort of retold Orpheus and Eurydice story also sort of rooted into my brain. Notions of returning from the underworld, coming back from a place of death, also threw itself into the mix. And at some point, I had the wonderful, illusory sensation of coming up with an idea. As I said earlier, novels don't come from one place. There's never one idea that gives you the novel. But there are moments where roots synthesize into a root system. And that feels like having an idea. And I remember actually, I think it was, you know what? It was February 14th. It was Valentine's Day. I was in Literati. Livia and I had just come from dinner and a movie, and we were browsing as we do whenever we can in Literati. And I saw a cover with a deer skull on it, and something about it shook something loose in my brain. And the skull, I don't know, it gave me a sense of a Hasidic Orpheus and Eurydice story, basically. And I worked on that for a little while. At the very first, the idea was a contemporary story. It was going to be set in Williamsburg, roughly speaking. There was going to be like a nearly extinct Hasidic sect that was going to have like one little shtiebel left, and there was going to be like one kid, and he's going to have like a mysterious guide who was going to take him into the subway system, and it was going to be the underworld, and it was going to be a whole thing. That wasn't as good an idea. Eventually, I came to the idea that turned into the way back more directly. And I think the sort of real scaffolding came in when I realized that there wasn't really any Jewish mass market fantasy out there. I grew up really a fantasy kid. Several of you will probably remember me reading paperback fantasy novels in shul. This was like my thing. My dad read me all of Tolkien. I say all of Tolkien. He didn't read the Silmarillion. No one reads the Silmarillion. But Harry Potter was 11 years old when that book came out, and I was an 11-year-old boy as well. I grew up alongside him throughout those 7 books. Fantasy was like really my flavor. And it was always strange to me that there didn't seem to be anything in like the fantasy, canon that spoke to Judaism at all. An essay came out in I think 2010. I don't remember offhand where it was published. I think it was the National Review of Jewish Books, but I'm not positive. The title of the essay was Why There Is No Jewish Narnia. And the thesis was basically that there isn't Jewish fantasy because fantasy is all derived from this sort of pseudo-medieval, rose-colored notion of like how wonderful it would be to charge around on a horse with a sword. And like it wasn't that wonderful to be a Jew in the Middle Ages. I don't find that argument compelling at all. There was a lot of wonderful Jewish life going on in Europe in the Middle Ages. And I thank you, Nat. I sort of that notion stuck in my craw, and I thought, well, surely this is a challenge. Surely there's a way to bring the sort of iconic architecture of fantasy and traditional Judaism together. And I think that's really where I knit together the way back. There are a lot of obvious overlaps if you think about it for not too long. There's in fantasy, there's often a small town or a farm from which the hero is called to adventure. And I thought to myself, well, why on earth wouldn't this be a shtetl? There's often a wise old wizard somewhere, usually dressed in dark robes and with a white beard. And I've been to Chabad. Have you guys? I mean, it seems pretty easy. And the further I went into it, the easier and more obvious it seemed. There, much of the, for those of you who are readers of fantasy, much you'll recognize that much of contemporary sort of popular fantasy is derived from English paradigms, largely because of the long history of fairies in folktales in the British Isles. There are these sort of liminal supernatural creatures who have their own interests and priorities, who interact with the living. They're not divine, they're not human, they're sort of in the cracks there. And if you go looking in Yiddish literature, you see these creatures all over the place. These are the Shadim. They're everywhere. These demons in the Jewish literature. It's really almost exactly the same function. And so I thought to myself, all right, I've got Hasidic wizards. I've got Shadim as fairies, and we've got a journey to death and back. Let's see what we come up with. And that's sort of how we got to the way back. For those of you who've had a chance to look at the book, you'll know that there are three major demons that occupy a lot of the story. And I'd like to talk a little bit about how I chose them, or rather how they came to me. Those three demons are Mammon, Lilith, and Duma. So I'm an inveterate researcher. As soon as something is interesting to me, I learn as much about it as I possibly can. I haunt libraries. They try to kick me out. I won't go. So one of the first things I did is I raided the truly, I have to say, world-class library system at the University of Michigan. Every day that I am not in Ann Arbor and don't have access to it is a day I am poorer as a writer. And I found several very helpful texts on demons generally in the library, and I was going through them looking for demons of Jewish origin particularly. And Mammon jumped out to me because Mammon is not a demon of Jewish origin, but the name, of course, is Hebrew. It means roughly lucre, like filthy gold in Hebrew. The way that Mammon became a demon actually was through Milton in Paradise Lost. Milton personifies Mammon as a demon. And this appealed to me very much because if we're writing in a 19th century Jewish context, money is one of the demons that is haunting Jewish people, right? The way that we were forced into sort of the middleman slot in the old world economic systems, the way that led us to develop monetary and capitalist systems in the new world. Monetary systems have been haunting Jews for a long time. So I thought to myself, okay, this is not a Jewish demon, but a demon who's going to be interested in Jews significantly. So I had one demon that I was interested in. And now, when you approach the topic of Jewish demons, the first demon that's going to come to the fore is always going to be Lilith. probably the most famous Jewish demon, which is a strange phrase. It was important to me that my vision of Lilith, who, by the way, probably, as many of these demons seem to be, developed out of an ancient Near Eastern goddess. The notion is that Lilith was likely original some sort of cult deity. In I think in Akkadian, my understanding is that Lilitu actually refers to a screech owl. And the idea is there are a couple of places in Tanakh where the word is used, and I think we believe it to refer to a screech owl in those contexts. But in folk tradition, she's personified and she becomes a sort of demon of femininity. And it was important to me, knowing that she is so prominent among Jewish demons, I was going to use her. It was important to me that just as Mammon haunts Jews with money, Lilith was going to haunt women with femininity. It is not the case, obviously, that we Jews are evil, mustache twirling, money grubbing folks. And in the same sense, Lilith, I think, personifies the particular pitfalls of feminine ways of moving through the world. It was very important to me not to use Lilith as she has often been used in the past to demonize all women, but rather I wanted to make sure that she, in my story, was deepening women's personhood. So hopefully that comes through in the book. She has her own wily ways that end up serving her and her alone. The third demon in my book, or not the third demon, but the third major demon, I will say, is Duma, whose name means silence. And I started thinking about Duma because there's a really fantastic book called The Jewish Dark Continent, which is about Shlomo Ansky's ethnographic work just before the First World War in the Pale of Settlement. He went out and he had this massive, incredible questionnaire that he would apply to people. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of extremely, extremely detailed leading questions. And so I got this book also from the University of Michigan library system. I was poking through it and sort of reading through these wonderful questions. And one of them really struck me. The question was, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, something to the extent of, do you have any stories of Duma beating a corpse in the grave with a chain? Now, it turns out that this is because Duma, who is one of the sort of fallen angel figures in Jewish demonology, is often associated with decomposition, right? So when there would be the terrible moment when either people would have to exhume a body or a body would come up to the surface by some process, they would see that the body had decomposed, and the sort of folk explanation for this fact was that Duma flays the body in the grave. And so this linked Duma up to decomposition in my mind, which further linked up to the terrible and very, very historical tradition of the impressment of Jewish children into the Tsarist army. This was a very real and very horrifying practice. They would take little Jewish kids, often like 10, 11, 12, and impress them. Sometimes they would make them officers through a course of like very terrible training. I don't mean to say officers in the sense of the sort of, this is getting a little bit in the weeds, but the system of regular soldiers and officers is derived basically from social class officers are equivalent roughly to um, nobles and gentle folks, and the schleppers who are actually doing the fighting are the common folks, the serfs and stuff. So obviously, Jews were never going to be noble in the same way, but sometimes they were cultivated into commanders in certain ways that were at the heads of small groups. But in any case, they were often kidnapped and basically thrown at the Tsar's enemies. And so this anxiety linked up to me with Duma. So in my book, Duma is a sort of decayed officer of the army of the dead who show up throughout the book in various anxiety-riddled ways. So those are sort of the three major demons that take their place in the book. And the other side of the coin, the light magic, where they're the demons occupy the darkness, are the Rebbeim, the Hasidim. There are so many stories, both in religious sources and obviously wonderfully all over secular Yiddish literature, of Rebbeim essentially being wizards. I mean, I made the connection in a glib way before, but the truth is, you read these wonderful parrots and singer stories that depict miracles being performed for those schleppers who we were talking about. And it was important to me because of the ways in which Christianity is indeed centered in a lot of popular fantasy, to claim that space for Jewish religious tradition in my book. And the example I'll point to is that if you are familiar with Harry Potter, as I suppose you must be, being a person who is alive, you may know that in Harry Potter, the spells are cast almost exclusively via the use of Latin magic words, which is basically lazy, right? Like, it's okay, it's an old learned language, Latin, fine, whatever. But obviously, to a Jew looking at this, you can't look at the Latin magic words and say anything other than like, oh, so they're all Catholics now. I'm not going to be casting any magic spells using Latin. So there is a passage in the way back in which the invented Rebbe of Zubinsk, who is the sort of great magical Hasidic figure in my book, casts several spells using quotations from Tanakh. So his magic words are biblical Hebrew, and that was a sort of answer that I was very proud to be able to issue to the easy use of Latin for magic words and other fantasy texts. The book itself is basically about life and death and the way that we move toward them and away from them. At the beginning of this talk, I mentioned that a mysterious stranger comes walking through the little shtetl of Tupik near the beginning of the book. Well, that mysterious stranger is the angel of death. And in my vision, the angel of death is a little bit different from the ways in which that entity has been seen in the past. There are a lot of wonderful stories in Jewish tradition about the angel of death and how they might appear. Most notably, there's a story in which the angel of death is a very, very, very beautiful woman who is so beautiful that she charms the soul into leaving the body through the eyes, which is fine if you're a straight man, but what do the rest of us do? So my thought was that the angel of death does indeed need to appeal to everyone whom they encounter. But the way to do this is likely not to look like someone else, but rather to look like ourselves. So my angel of death matches their appearance to the appearance of the person whom they're meeting. This angel of death is masculine. This angel of death is feminine. This angel of death is wealthy. This angel of death is poor. However, it best suits the individual who they're encountering. And for me, this felt very resonant because of my particular experience meeting death for the first time, which was wearing a face that looked like my own. Now, you are probably sitting there thinking, this all sounds very enchanting and also terribly depressing. I am here to tell you it's not. I wasn't interested in that kind of a book. There are already so many books on all the shelves about how terrible death is. It's boring, honestly. We know, like, no one needs to persuade you that death is an uncomfortable thing to experience. So I'm not going to tell you precisely what happens at the climax of my book, but I can promise you this. If you take the time to read it, and I hope that you will, when you reach that climax, you're not going to come away feeling worse. For me, the project of the book was in some ways about throwing myself down a ladder. Obviously, I was deep in my own mourning, and I had to figure out a way to get out of it. And because this is what I do, even when I don't want to, even when I'm not trying, the best way for me to figure out how to do it was to sort of write my way out, to borrow a phrase. And it worked for me. So I hope that if you all take the time to explore the book, you will feel similarly. It's entertaining if you're not grieving. It's helpful if you are grieving. And even if you're not grieving yet, it might be helpful in the future. So I would love to take some questions from folks in just a little bit, but because this is an event that is very different from the normal event that I do, given that you are all who you all are, I thought I would share with you a little treat. I very recently, good Lord, 2 weeks ago, Monday, submitted the manuscript of my new novel to my editor. So before I do this, I'm going to go ahead and tell you this all may be cut. But I thought it might be fun to share with you a little bit of my writing that no one has ever read or heard outside of the very, very tight inner circle. So I'm going to end here before I take questions by reading you a very short snippet at the very beginning of the new manuscript, which is considerably less overtly Jewish. I would tell you the title of the book at this juncture, but I'm terrible at titles. I can't do it. It's always like a 3-month conversation amongst several email accounts. So at the moment, this novel, though completed, is without a name. But I hope you'll get a little sense for it from this opening section, and then I will happily take your questions. Mrs. Jenny Blodgett presents the amazing Little Ava Root, clairvoyant, spirit medium, channeler of the voices of the departed. Her uncanny abilities shock the senses. She brings forth the messages of the dead. Come and see, come and see, come and see. During the first week of June, 1893, these handbills were unavoidable in the little village of Natick, Ohio. Mailed ahead, they were as common as coal dust by the time Mrs. Blodgett and I arrived, piled by the door at the Hoffman Emporium, boot-trodden and filthy on the floor of Wilson's saloon, and wherever Mrs. Blodgett encountered them, she bent to add the following lines in her rigid, toothy hand. Wednesday at 8, back room at Wilson's. 35 cents, just like magic. Thank you all. Who's got a question?
Thank you so much. That was so wonderful. Please feel free to either unmute yourselves or ask a question in the chat if you'd like.
Surely somebody's got to have a question. I mean, I know the Zoldens have been drinking over there. Oh, I see a question actually here in the chat from Harvey Summers, who asks, "Why does the Angel of Death use a honed spoon?" This is true. In the book, the angel there's a plot point where Bluma recovers an instrument that the Angel of Death drops, and it's a spoon with a sharp edge. And for me, the spoon is there because of the subversion of what the Angel of Death is supposed to look like. So there's a really wonderful folk tradition that when a death occurs in a house, you're supposed to pour out all of the standing water in the house for fear that the Angel of Death has washed his sword or dagger in that water before departing. And in this particular scene that Harvey refers to, Bluma has just seen death arrive in her house as an old woman. And so I thought it would be fun if instead of a knife, she were using a spoon. And that's really where the idea came from. There is a decent payoff toward the end of the book involving the spoon directly. Like so much of the writing process, that's a decision that I made early on that ended up paying off in a way that I didn't imagine it would. Writing is a crazy improvisation that you then go back and try to make look like you knew what you were doing all along. But I will say, actually, I'm sitting in my office right now. I'm at my desk, and I'll show this to you because you bring it up. I've been lucky to publish my first two novels both in the UK as well as the US, and I got a wonderful gift from my UK editor in the mail when the book was published. This is it. I don't know if you can really see there. It says The Way Back, Gavriel, Savit, in November 2020, which is a very lovely and thoughtful gift. That's Ruth Knowles right there. She's full of thoughtful gifts. My daughter Lily is still obsessed with the sweatshirt that she sent when her little sister, my younger daughter Molly, was born. Okay, my aunt, my cousin is asking on behalf of her husband, what's the real backstory behind Avi Melech? That is A, vague, and B, hard to explain. I don't know. We'll talk about it at Thanksgiving or something. It's so. This is actually hard. I would be happy to talk about this, except for that it does actually spoil a significant plot point for those who haven't read the book. So I'm not going to talk too much about that one. Mark Saper very kindly asks, has The Way Back been nominated for any awards yet? Yes, I was very, very honored that The Way Back was a finalist for the National Book Award this year, which is the kind of honor that no one gets to expect. And that, yeah, thank you, Marlene. And that I do not really adequately know how to thank people for. It's really tremendously flattering. And as Nat mentioned, just last week, The Way Back actually won the National Jewish Book Award for Young Adult Literature, which is also tremendously flattering. There is, and this is a particular group of people to say this to. There is no honor that is so moving as the honor that comes from one's own. So to be honored by that Jewish Book Foundation is really, really wonderful. Michael Weiss, the king of Jewish Twitter, asks, if I was influenced at all by the Throwing Shade podcast about Jewish demonology. I listened to a couple of episodes. The truth of the matter is I'm a terrible podcast snob. If podcasts are not like significantly edited and packaged, I often feel like I can be spending my ear time, which is unsurprisingly rare with two small children, in more pleasing places. So while that is in fact a wonderful podcast, I felt like I had to sift through conversation a little much too. But this is also, for what it's worth, this also very well may be my fault because I'm also a completist. So I start at the beginning of podcasts, and no podcast is good at the beginning because it's a very new medium and everyone's still learning how to do everything. I also have this problem with television, by the way. I insist on starting with a pilot, and they're never any good. Which is to say, I shut myself out of way too much good stuff. David Hirschfeld, did I take any inspiration from Hindu religious texts? No, I didn't particularly. It's interesting. I think we have, as Jews, a picture of our culture and religion that overemphasizes our isolation. There's a notion that our religious and spiritual ways have not been influenced by other religious traditions, which I think is pretty clearly not the case. So it's interesting. Near the end, or near the climax of the book, rather, there's a view and a discussion of concepts of Jewish reincarnation, which align to a certain extent with some Eastern notions of reincarnation. We don't see Jewish ideas of reincarnation showing up until relatively late in the mystical record. It's an old religion, right? So relatively recently, and we're talking about the beginning of modernity here. But I am not. I think there's a game of telephone going on about the soul, basically throughout mystical traditions. I think, particularly in Eastern Europe, we got a lot of stuff from Christian mysticism that probably got a lot of stuff from Islam, that probably got a lot of stuff from Hinduism and Buddhism. So while I didn't directly study any Hindu notions of the soul and of reincarnation, I certainly see some of those rhymes. Okay. This is a long question from Zach Alexander. Bruce McAllister sent this question to 150 writers in the 60s. So I'll ask you, do readers ever infer that there is symbolism in your writing or you had not intended it to be? If so, what is your feeling about this type of inference? Humorous, annoying, etc. The answer is, of course. It's one of the most wonderful and frustrating things about writing fiction. You have this whole very private, personal, made-up universe that you inhabit, often for a year or longer, while you're putting these things together. And the process of publishing a book is the process of inviting whoever wants to come into your little private universe. And always they rearrange the furniture. They say, oh, I don't like this paint color. You know what I mean? So definitely all written text, and certainly written text that aims at art, only functions because of individual interpretations other than the intended interpretation of the creator. So definitely. I remember when I was touring to promote On the Swellman, I was in the UK for a little while, and there was a very, what's the word? Confident college student who, truth be told, not, to give the English their due, I think he was French and he was studying in England. And he asked me this question in the Q&A. He asked me, is there any particular reason you named the character Anna? And I said, yeah. And I sort of explained my reasoning. I like that it has lots of different inflections to lots of different languages or whatever. I finished the answer. He raised his hand again. He said, but is it not Anna Frank? And I was like, well, no. And also that wasn't her name. But so, you know, everyone's going to make their own decisions, and that's encouraged. That's the game. Everyone should read a book as themselves, and you should, please God, not try and figure out what I was thinking, because you can't. Okay. Okay. Now I'm getting a lot here. George Siegel wants to know what the demon Dentalion represents. Dentalion is another demon who appealed to me because of sort of non-Jewish interpretations. The demon Dentalion is often known as the master of whispers, and often is depicted carrying a large book. And I wanted to play around with demon books. And so my Dentalion becomes a very, very long book in many library halls. And that allows me to play with a yeshiva, a demonic yeshiva. So there's another thing for you all to look forward to when you buy your several copies of the book. Now my cousin wants to know which podcasts are good. There are many podcasts that I can recommend. I'll do like 3 right now. The first that I will recommend is a podcast that I have appeared on, but it's not nepotism. It is my favorite podcast. I was privileged to get to know one of the hosts very well when I was living in New Haven. It's the podcast Unorthodox. Genuinely fantastic. The kind of Jewish socialization that you often miss living in Springfield, Illinois. Listen, I love Springfield, Illinois. The Jewish community is not huge. There's not a lot of places to kibitz. Unorthodox has a lot of kibitzing for you. What else is good? This is actually particularly for you, Ariel. I have been binging a lot of film music podcasts during the pandemic. It's weird, but I like them. There's a fantastic podcast that you can go to the beginning of, and it holds up, called Settling the Score, which is 2 nerdy dudes talking about film music that I really, really love. And what I've done recently, I'm now on a binge through the wonderful, weird podcast Dead Eyes, which is by this comedian who was cast in the HBO miniseries Band of Brothers, and was then subsequently fired by Tom Hanks. And like it's sort of like investigative report into how the nicest guy in the world could possibly have fired him. It's very entertaining, and itches a deep scratch I have about the entertainment industry that we won't get into now. Harvey Summers asks, did your approach to writing evolve from lessons you learned from your first 2 books to make writing the new manuscript more efficient and easier? This is an excellent question. Certainly, I think practice is helpful. That's the understatement of the year, right? This is actually, I'll tie it back to what I was just saying about the entertainment industry. One of the reasons that it's so difficult for people to succeed in theater is that in order to get good at making art, you have to make it all the time. You have to be working at it. You have to be doing it. And the problem with theater is that you can't make it without someone giving you permission first. You have to, wait for someone to choose you from the reams and reams of other actors out there. So I got to a point in my acting career when I just wanted to be doing something, because I felt like I was stagnating and not improving. And I wanted to be working. And one of the great things about writing, by contrast, is that all it takes is for you to sit down in order for you to be able to write fiction. So certainly, as I have more experience, I'm coming up. I'm closer now to a decade of full-time writing than I am to half a decade. As I accrue experience, I certainly know myself as a creator better. I certainly know pitfalls better. But the truth of the matter is, man, every new novel is like wrestling, a creature that you didn't know existed and you can't see clearly. There's no silver bullet. Whatever was working for you on a previous project is almost certainly not going to work for you on the next project. I have a few tricks that consistently work for me, primary of which is that the first thing I do when I'm developing a new idea is I start to put together a playlist of music that feels like the idea to me. Um, so I have playlists that match up with not only all of the completed projects that I have, but also all of the abandoned projects that I have, which is both inspiring and depressing, like, all of life as a professional artist. But interestingly enough, I have recently been goaded by my wife into updating my website. And I put the Spotify playlists that I write to for the particular projects up on my website. So if you're interested in at all, you can visit gavrielsavit.com and you can find the playlist for On the Swallow Man. You can find the playlist for The Way Back, and you can also find the playlist for the mysterious titleless project that I read for at the end for you. You cannot yet find the playlist for the thing that I am currently working on, but we must keep some secrets, mustn't we? Christopher Wolf Kendall asks, how is your writing as opposed to your career different from having majored in music in college as opposed to, say, English? So I'm lucky enough now to be able to write full time, which is not a distinction that really anyone gets anymore. So I'm lucky enough to call myself a career writer at this point. And when I do call myself anything as an actor, it's semi-retired. There's not a whole lot of union acting to be done in Springfield, Illinois. Um, but so, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm very, very grateful to have been taught to behave as a professional in art in my training program. As I just mentioned, music remains a really, really big part of my creative process, both to sort of help me organize my ideas and also as a sort of Pavlovian bell to slip me into the idea again more easily. But the truth of the matter is, and I know I'm going to anger a lot of academics about this, I'm not sure what you study in college really matters that much. I think as long as you can figure out how to be interested in things, you'll be all right. Now, to be fair, I'm an autodidact and not everyone is. Um, but the thing to me that is really most important in teaching and training young people, which I am very privileged to be able to do a little bit of these days, is to get them excited and get them doing things because they want to. Because so much of our very deeply necessary skill based schooling is involved with doing things that you don't want to do. And I think a lot of people get to the end of their schooling career not really understanding what it feels like to be excited about work, which is a problem. And I was excited by the things that I was studying in school. And I also skipped a lot of classes to go to the library. So, it's going to be what it's going to be. Liz Fried asks, the notion of soul in Western tradition is Greek. I would argue with that. I don't think there's just one notion of the soul in Western tradition. And I certainly don't think that the Western tradition is exclusively Greek. I mean, there's the ancient Athens, Jerusalem paradigm, but I also think, what do we call the West anymore? The world is too small for these distinctions. Notions of the soul. Yeah, I don't know. This is a much bigger conversation and not a question. Christopher Kendall again, has anyone approached you about the screen rights for your books? I cannot yet tell you the answer to that question. So, stay tuned. But I cannot yet tell you the answer to that question. If there are any other questions, speak now or forever hold your peace.
I have a question for you.
Hit it.
It's something we've actually discussed before, so I'm curious to see.
A reading question. Is this a Jewish group?
So we've kind of been talking a lot about creating a genre of Jewish fantasy. And identified that one of the challenges is the kind of Jungian archetype of the hero's quest, at least in modern literature, is so often translated directly to kind of a Christ-like figure. And I think, you were talking about resurrection from a Greek epic context, but I think most texts that deal with this kind of epic fantasy genre are talking about a very Christian type of resurrection. And given that you've written a fantasy novel about characters, in a sense, traveling to the underworld in this kind of same mindset of, redemption from death, or at least escape from death. I guess, how do you reconcile that kind of very Christian trope of emerging from the dead and really setting a path forward for Jewish fantasy literature?
So this is a very, very good question. The reference that Nat is making is actually to a conversation that we had that I don't think she knew at the time was going to influence my writing. We went together to see the short-lived, bizarre, kind of nice and now deeply regrettable Broadway musical Soul Doctor about Shlomo Carlebach. And at the time, I was writing the first iteration of On the Swallow Man, and I hadn't plotted it out. I didn't really know where we were going. And sort of based on some easy cultural biases that Nat is referencing, I assumed that the Swallow Man was going to die at some point because she's right. The architecture that we like, now I'm going to make reference to the Western tradition, and Liz Fried is going to kill me. But the sort of story architecture that we expect in the West relies a lot on martyrdom as a marker of heroic transition. And Nat pointed out to me and the reason that this came up at Soul Doctor is that there was a character who sort of represented the joy of Shabbos in the old world shtetl context, who was then symbolically murdered in the Holocaust, and she was like, I hate that, and she was right because it is deeply, deeply Christian, and also. I will say this. So obviously in the way back, there is no martyrdom like that. Death functions separately from the return from the land of the dead. And I also, tangentially, really, really hate the way that death seems to have no stakes in a lot of contemporary fantasy. For me, when the TV show Game of Thrones jumped the shark, was when, spoilers, but this is ages ago, when they brought Jon Snow back from the dead, because the show begins like they set up that it's this really gritty universe by beheading the main character at the end of the first season, right? And it's like, oh my god, people actually die. But then we get to like the height of the story, and then someone comes back from the dead. So it turns out death has no stakes anyway. So that's my rant about that. And there is also some storytelling danger, right? Like if it's understood that death is temporary, then how do you actually have any weight in the universe of your story? So it really presents some serious problems, both from the perspective of the storyteller and also specifically from the perspective of the Jewish storyteller who's committed to not mindlessly rehearsing Christian archetypes. That being said, I've talked about Chabad a little bit already. One of my best friends in Springfield is the Shaliach here, who, believe it or not, is younger than I am. And we've had a lot of conversation about Hasidus in general and specific notions within Hasidus. And on a couple of occasions, I've said to him, doesn't that seem pretty Christian to you? And he said to me, well, listen, just because it's Christian doesn't mean it's wrong, which is true. I mean, a lot of the stuff that's in Christianity came from us to begin with. And I think certainly if you look at the rhythm of the Jewish year, if you look at Pesach, there's a reason that, Pesach became the archetype for the sort of notion of the Christological sacrifice. The idea of death and rebirth is also strongly present in Judaism. Strongly present. I think we've downplayed it significantly since our host culture, particularly for Ashkenazim, became Christian. But the source code is present in our culture as well. So I think the answer is to not to avoid a deeply human archetype concerning death and rebirth. After all, I talked earlier about my very personal experience with the intertwining of birth and death. And I think the idea that we can separate birth from anxieties about death is a privilege afforded by very recent developments in medicine. I think for most of Jewish history, certainly human history, death and birth have been strongly intertwined. So the answer, I think, is not to try and avoid something that is fundamentally human out of concern that it might inadvertently be or seem Christian, but rather to, if one wants to use the archetypes that speak to contemporary audiences, to choose to do so in a way that is fundamentally Jewish rather than being fundamentally Christian, which is a difficult needle to thread, of course. But, ultimately, all writing is generic, all storytelling is generic. And while there were paradigms of storytelling that predated the sort of martyrdom fetish of Christianity, they don't speak to readers anymore. So one needs to speak in the language in which one is going to be understood. And I don't think that playing with the intertwinement of life and death and of resurrection is necessarily inherently Christian. Does that make sense? Is that fair? Cool. Emily asks, would you use the word spiritual in describing yourself, your books, or the experience that shaped the books? Yeah, I mean, I very much dislike the contemporary notion that religion and spirituality are distinct. I think that's no older than the 1960s. I think that's a way for people to not do the hard work of living a religious life. You can't have the fruit without growing the tree. Because the thing is, the longer you spend on codified systems of spirituality, like at some point you're going to end up with a religion. So yes, I'm a religious person. I'm also a spiritual person. I think that they are necessarily and strongly intertwined. And another way to describe this dichotomy is via discussions of mysticism and rationalism, which I think are also often fallaciously opposed. Human beings are mystical and spiritual and also rationalist and scientific and religious and magical. To quote Reb Whitman, we contain multitudes. You know what I'm saying? So I think this idea, the idea of the opposition of these things is not inherent in Emily's question. So I may be answering a question that you're not asking, but it's inherent in a lot of my feelings about these questions, which is to say, everyone should be allowed to be religious and spiritual and all the things. We're not consistent. You shouldn't have to try. Harvey Summers, I'm only on page 120 of the way back, so I haven't met the Rebbe of Zubinsk yet, but do you think you might be interested in a future novel featuring this character? Again, it depends on how much you're paying, Harvey. Yeah, I mean, once you get to the end of the book, we can maybe talk about potential sequels. But there are some hanging tales there that I might be interested someday in returning to. And life is long. Who knows? And with that, I have kept you all far too long. You've been very indulgent. If there are any other questions, happy to take them wherever, but I'm sure my wife is very hungry. So I should let you all skitter off. You can, oh, let me say this before I go. You should buy my book. If you're not going to, that's fine. You should buy books in general. You should buy books, if at all possible, from your local independent bookstore. That can be complicated. I happen to know that Literati is particularly good at this. They do curbside pickup. You should do that. If you do not have a local independent bookstore to patronize, like Nebuch, we do not have here in Springfield, Illinois, how is this possible? Bookshop.org is where you need to go online for books. Don't buy any books from Amazon unless they're my books. And if you're buying my books, buy them elsewhere. Bookshop.org, fantastic resource. They share a third of their profit with local independent bookstores. It is the solution to the problem of people who want to buy books and don't want to feed evil Jeff Bezos. So that's my parting thought. I cannot wait until we can all be in the same room reading books and davening and everything together again. Liz Freed asks a very good question. Why do you live in a town without a bookstore? There are great bookstores here. None of them are first-run local independent bookstores. And secondly, also because I have a wife who has a job and I need health insurance in a global pandemic, but also in general. And I like my wife a little bit. And now I'm going to go eat dinner with her. So thank you all so much for listening to me prattle. I hope this has been enjoyable, and I'll look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thank you so much, Gavi. That was wonderful and so enjoyable. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, everybody. Have a great night.